And we are live. Welcome everyone to another lecture in the Old Schoolhouse Lecture Series. Good evening to all of you. I'm Gabatia Moreno, and I'm going to be your host tonight. The Old Schoolhouse Lecture Series is a partnership between the 29 Palms Historical Society and the Desert Institute, and the lecture series began about 17 years ago. Tonight's program is one of 10 monthly lectures and discussions that we hold on the second Fridays of each month. Before we officially begin, I want to take a moment to respectfully acknowledge the past, present, and future of the indigenous peoples who have stewarded the lands we are on for time immemorial. So for Joshua Tree and 29 Palms, I want to acknowledge the Mojave, the Cahuilla, the Serrano, and the Chemehuevi peoples, and the 29 Palms Band of Mission Indians. And for Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is where I'm tuning in from, I want to acknowledge the Pueblo and the Jicarilla Apache peoples. I want to thank the Desert Institute. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Desert Institute, they are the educational branch of the Joshua Tree National Park Association. And they are, of course, one of the partners in the making of this event. Now we're going to go through a little bit of the housekeeping rules, is what I call them. And that's just to make sure that we all have the best possible time that we can in this space. So first rule is be nice in the chat. We love to hear from you. We really enjoy your commentary, any additions to what's going on in the presentation. Any questions that you have, I'm going to ask you to go into that Ask a Question button on the screen and submit it in that way, just to make sure that at the end of the presentation, we can go in order through all the questions and we don't miss anything. So please check those out. If we do get disconnected, please wait a little bit and refresh your browsers. We're going to be doing our troubleshooting on our end. If you are experiencing an issue, there is a help button at the top of the chat, and you can check that out to see how to troubleshoot. But if you continue to experience issues, I would say drop a comment on the chat, so maybe other people are also experiencing the issue, and they can say, hey, I'm also experiencing this. And at that point, I can interrupt the presentation, and we'll make sure that we get something fixed and then continue. Last but not least, replay of the event will be available to everyone who registered. And so you can watch the replay on this same link that you're watching this event, or you can also check your email and you will get the replay there. Without much further ado, I want to welcome you all to this presentation about the history of water in the Morongo Basin, a perspective on an undervalued resource by Marina West. And Marina, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Gabicia. Good evening and welcome. Do we have good sound? And can you see the pointer?
We have good sound and we can see it.
Okay. Thank you, friends, family, neighbors, and strangers for joining us tonight. I want to thank Kevin Wong of the Desert Institute and also Les Snodgrass of the 29 Palms Historical Society for organizing the annual lecture series. I also want to acknowledge all the wonderful volunteers at 29 Palms and Morongo Basin Historical Societies. They assisted me with resources which enabled me to piece together this talk to share with you. Lastly, I want to personally thank Steve Tuttle of Copper Mountain Mesa and Anna Garcia, previously with the Mojave Water Agency. I will also directly quote from many resources which are listed at the end of the presentation. And since I've less than an hour to share 1.7 billion years of history, I'd better get started. You may have heard of plate tectonics. If the world were flat, it would look like this picture. Continents, as we know them today, and the plate boundaries in black. Joshua Tree sits right on a plate boundary. 1.7 billion years ago, we were one big supercontinent that looked very different. In the next few slides, taken directly from the Geology of Joshua Tree National Park by D.D. Trent will help illustrate what has happened. But from this image, think ocean plate and continental Pacific plate, the boundary of which cuts through the Morongo Basin. As for the Morongo Basin, mountain building began 1.7 billion years ago during the geologic eras known as the Proterozoic and on into the Precambrian period. Some of the outcropping rocks in the area are roots of an ancient mountain range on the continent at that time. A long period of uplift and erosion occurred between 1.7 billion and 250 million years ago. Our region has no rock record for most of this period of time, but we do have rock outcrops dating before and after that time, and other evidence tells us that marine sediments likely covered all the area, but these were subsequently eroded. The rock outcrops of our region do reveal their origin through the subduction of oceanic plate beneath the continental plate between 250 and 75 million years ago, a period otherwise known as the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods. These rock formations from the age of the dinosaurs have granitic intrusions due to tectonically shifting plates and volcanism. There are also rock fragments that had once been part of the ocean floor. During this time, the melted rock masses, or magma, finally began to cool, some before breaching the surface. Being the last to solidify, gold was squeezed into the fractures, creating the veins sought after by the early miners. The subduction and subsequent uplift created the east-west trending Little San Bernardino Mountains, which encompassed the Joshua Tree National Park. More recently, as in the last 10 to 75 million years, widespread erosion begins corresponding to renewed uplifting of the deep crust. The subduction zone is substituted for a transformed strike-slip boundary known as the San Andreas Fault. Formation of rock plutons ends, and faulting causes basaltic intrusion of the crust, which breaches the surface, resulting in lava flows of tertiary and quaternary age, 1.6 million years. For those who are not aware, as you travel from the Morongo Valley to the I-10, you cross 3 separate strands of the San Andreas Fault along Highway 62. Between 10 and 30 million years ago, the area was a warm, semi-arid climate. There was savanna-like grasslands and even tropical grassland. There was a thick soil horizon. Beginning around 10 million years ago, the coast ranges and the Sierra Nevada produced a rain shadow across the Mojave region, and the area transitioned to a hot, dry climate. Approximately 1.7 million years ago, an ice age climate switches back and forth from glacial to temperate. Alluvial fans form, while pediments and Inselbergs emerge as soil cover erodes. There is continued minor volcanism and earthquakes. These younger basalt flows can be seen in the Pipes Canyon area, what we now know as the Black Lava Butte National Monument. So a quick recap. From 1.7 billion years ago, calm marine seas, then collision and subduction, plates moving, uplift, followed by collision, scraping, and the creation of the San Andreas Fault, a modern-day geologic structure of the Morongo Basin. Now remember, the 2 tallest mountains in Southern California are right here in our backyard, San Gorgonio and San Jacinto Mountain, created when something had to move out of the way of the squeeze. To accommodate, the rocks went up. So back to the water. These blocks of faulted crust created an extremely irregular topography of mountain ranges and intervening basins. The basins are poorly linked, preventing water flow from one basin to another. Instead, each basin serves as a giant receptacle for sediment washed from short streams that drain immediately adjacent mountains. These were the ancient Ice Age lakes. And Joshua Tree Highlands right here on the map. This is the Pipes Wash that drains to Emerson Dry Lake. Beneath the beds of Emerson, as well as other dry lakes in the area, such as Melville, Means, Mesquite, the unconsolidated deposits are more likely to consist almost exclusively of clay and silt. Deposits beneath Emerson Lake are thicker than others, as physiographic evidence indicates the ancestral Pipes Wash drainage contributed significantly more sediment than other drainages in the area. This is a picture looking east into Pipes Canyon, and it shows the black basalt lava flows above the Old Woman's Sandstone. Note that the basalt must have flowed flat over the land surface, so this picture really shows how much erosion occurred during the Ice Age snow melt and subsequent erosion. The power of water has downcut through the basalt and sandstone and carried those materials down the drainage to the terminus at Emerson Dry Lake. And during the ice melt, Pipes Wash flowed like the Colorado River does today. It's a very wide and deep channel, and in areas the banks are as high as 100 feet. Directly beneath these dry lakes, the deposits are fine-grained and yield little water with generally poor quality, but along the edges, the quality of water tends to be better. So water caused erosion, which carried the sediments downslope and filled the low valleys. Earthquake faults formed during all the turmoil to provide barriers which slow the flow of groundwater, enabling the water to be stored or confined within a subbasin as it filled. Here is a cross-section of the earth, like a large slice of layered cake from the side. This section cuts across Pipes Wash at Winters Road, about 4,000 feet in each direction. The depth is about 1,000 feet, as this scale is shown in elevation above sea level. The blue represents the water saturated zone, and the brown would be the bedrock, and the well logs provide that information for us. For my talk on water, I was led to the definition by the Department of Water Resources for the Morongo Groundwater Basin, 1954. The Morongo Groundwater Basin is about 1,000 square miles and is surrounded by the Ord and Granite Mountains on the north, the Bullion Mountains on the east, the San Bernardino Mountains to the west, and the Little San Bernardino Mountains to the southeast, to the south. The Morongo Groundwater Basin is separated into 17 subbasins, but I'm only showing 10 here. Today, the groundwater basins shown on this map are recharged by significantly less infiltration because of the limited ephemeral stream flows dominating for the last 10,000 years. For this reason, the areas of Landers and Yucca Valley and Joshua Tree have imported state water project water brought in from the Sacramento Delta to supplement the native supply through artificial recharge. As logic would have it, groundwater barriers are generally defined by faults. And this is the busiest slide I'll show, and I apologize. Extensive faulting, shown in red, of the consolidated rocks and the unconsolidated deposits has occurred. Many bedrock hills protrude from the alluvium, forming natural barriers to groundwater movement. These hills are associated with these northwest trending faults that divide the larger groundwater basins into units or subbasins. However, one major fault, the Pinto Mountain Fault, crosses the basin east to west until it terminates into the San Andreas Fault just outside the Morongo Basin, or just outside the Morongo Valley. Here's another slice of our earth cake, 8 miles wide and around 1,000 feet deep, cutting north to south, generally along Highway 247, starting at Pipes Wash. Corresponding to the last image, here in the subsurface, we interpret buried bedrock ridges covered with unconsolidated water-bearing alluvium from our well drilling logs. Water is available throughout the white area below the blue water table line, and the brown area being bedrock. So that is a brief background of the area, covering about 1.7 billion years of geologic history on how the water got here. I spent a significant amount of time researching the archives of both the 29 Palms and the Morongo Basin Historical Societies, the United States Geological Survey special reports, several books, magazines, and of course, I consulted the internet. I also consulted with my friend Ana Garcia, who then worked with the Mojave Water Agency. So this is an important juncture to discuss what I will not cover in this lecture. I relied on my discoveries to guide the content of this talk, and as my research continued, the volume grew too large. I decided to concentrate on places that can be visited and explored to this day, in hopes of taking you back in time before toilet and tap came to the high desert, if only for a brief moment to gain a better appreciation of the resource beneath us, which is so vital to existence here. So I will not discuss our water districts as they exist today, or even how they came to be. I will also not be discussing water resources within the Joshua Tree National Park, nor will I cover much of anything happening in the Morongo Valley, and I will briefly touch on the oasis of Mara and life at Warren's Well, as any of these could be a single lecture on their own with so many published resources available. The map on the screen shows the locations where water resources were developed by early pioneers, and these are the stories I intend to summarize in the remaining time we have. And again, I apologize, but the sites are these sort of squiggly blue lines around the Morongo Basin area here. So for a little bit of context, Highway 62, Highway 247, Johnson Valley area, Pioneer Town, Flamingo Heights Landers, the Marine Base, Yucca Valley, Joshua Tree, and the 29 Palms area. So let's start with a brief word about water rights. Water rights laws in California are markedly different from laws governing water use in other states. Seasonal, geographic, and quantitative differences in precipitation caused California's system to develop to a unique blend of two very different kinds of rights: riparian and appropriative. Riparian rights usually come with owning a parcel of land that is adjacent to a source of water, like a stream or a spring. A riparian right entitles the landowner to use a correlative share of the water which would naturally flow through the property. Riparian rights do not entitle a water user to divert water to storage in a reservoir for use in an off-season, nor do they allow use of water on land outside the watershed. Riparian rights remain with the property when it changes hands. But when we're not adjacent to a stream folks like miners and agricultural users developed a system of posting notice to stake their claim to an amount of water. This signaled the birth of today's appropriative rights system. It allowed others to divert available water from the same river or stream, but their rights existed within a hierarchy of priorities. This became known as the first in time, first in right principle. On the left side of the screen here is the notice of water appropriation by William Shea for a site in Barker Canyon recorded in 1915. From the book, Heart Bar Ranch and Johnson Valley Neighbors, the author noted that water wells were dug at the various freight stations beginning in the 1890s. Places like Old Woman Springs and Ames Well, Rock Corral, Cottonwood Springs, Means Well, and Rabbit Springs. I'm going to share some history on the Rock Corral, Ames Well, and the Means Well from this grouping. Rock Corral is located in the Johnson Valley area where Larea Road terminates into the mountain front. It's easily found that way, this being the Johnson Valley Improvement Association right here. So you just travel up the dirt road and you'll find your way right into the canyon where the spring is. In the late 1800s, winter cattle grazing came to Lucerne and Johnson Valleys, Pipes Canyon, Morongo and Yucca Valley, and in the summer, the cattle were driven to Big Bear. Through a series of events between January 1884 and 1907, two men, Charlie Martin and Albert Swarthoff, came into the cattle business as well. At times, they owned and occupied the Heart Bar Ranch in Big Bear and the Old Woman Springs Ranch out past Johnson Valley on Highway 247. Swarty and Charlie spent the better part of a winter around 1907 developing water at Rock Corral. They dug 2 tunnels into the mountain at the location of a spring and piped the water to a trough in the corral downhill. They also built a shack there where supplies and bedrolls were kept for overnight stays. And here we have the existing Rock Corral and the water trough right here. In the lower right is a recent photo of Swarty, and above that, a picture of the original wooden water tank, long gone from the site. A blue bucket now captures the spring flow from an old steel tank at the existing picnic area. The cottonwoods further up the canyon reveal the location of the actual spring up here. The spring wells up water from behind a fault line. In 1909, the United States Geological Survey reported the water to be abundant and good at this location. And I found a reference stating that in 1922, there were over 1,000 head of cattle in Johnson Valley, so a water supply was critical to their survival. From Rock Corral, they might travel a short distance grazing cattle out to the Means Well, north on the valley floor, where King of the Hammers is held today. So here we go from Rock Corral, this area, up to the Means Well. As stated previously, water below the dry lake beds or playas is salty because evaporation exceeds inflow and percolation to the low spot or sink. The result is increased mineral concentration in the soil. This concentrates with whatever water does percolate or migrate underground towards the sink. However, waters found about the border and at short distances back from the dry lake are relatively pure since they have not yet encountered those high alkaline soils. This is the case at the Means Well. The Means Well was hand dug below 16 feet and originally fitted with a windmill to pump water, but changing winds twisted the tower, wrecked the wheels, and kept blowing the tail off. Expensive and never-ending damage, coupled with continued failing of the well due to sanding, Swarty had to come up with a new plan. So he dug a large ramp or trough to the depth of water. Cattle would wander down this ramp, drink, and wander out the other side. It required very little maintenance, using a plow, shovels, and buckets to clean out the drinking trough that sat just below the water line. Remnants of this ramp here on Google Earth and out in the field can be seen today, as well as the old well and the slab where the windmill was. And last year in February, there was water filling the ramp. So from Rock Corral or the Ames Well, they would move further east onto what is now the Marine base to a point known as the Ames Well. Swarty and his partner Charlie ran their winter cattle from Lucerne Valley all the way to Pipes Canyon. The Ames Well was one of Swarty's watering holes located about 25 miles from the Old Woman Springs Ranch. The water was also an essential resource for locals, miners, stagecoaches, and freight wagons coming and going across the land from Victor, modern-day Victorville, to the Dale Mining District out past 29 Palms and beyond. The photo on the left is looking at the west side of Mount Hidalgo with the Ames Well located again on the edge of a dry lake playa. Since it's on the Marine base, this was about as close as I could get without being detected. The Ames Well is located along the ancestral Pipes Wash, where it nears its terminus at Emerson Dry Lake up off to the left of the slide here. Originally, the Ames Well had 4 feet of water in the bottom at an unknown depth. A windmill pumped to a storage tank and a watering trough. In January 1916, just after the worst windstorm anyone could remember experiencing, a Mr. Julian Gobar, a well driller of sorts from Lucerne Valley, was hired by Swarty to fix his Ames Well gone haywire, ceasing to produce water. This lack of water at the site required the well to be fixed and also required that a cowboy keep the persistent cattle from returning to their accustomed and yet waterless area. Swarty the cattleman and Julian Gobar the well driller and a couple other hardy desert cowboys, Gus Yeager and Vern Pratt, took part in the effort. Upon pulling the pipe, pump rods, and cylinder, they found it packed tight with fine sand. They first tried to just clean out the sand from within the well by rigging up a cable and pulley and small bucket to haul sand out of the well. They rigged pulleys over the windmill tower and hitched it to a horse. The horse pulled the bucket, a 10-foot iron pipe with a steel flapper on the base. Vern would lower the bucket into the well, digging into the fine, wet quicksand, and the horse would pull it back to the surface. Julian himself called it a Rube Goldberg setup when describing it in his book, Raising the Dust. After a day and a half, they made no headway at all, and the last bucket was loaded with only sand and no water. It took the better part of an hour to clean out the bucket. The sand was a bluish gray, and when stirred in a bucket of water, it was very fluid. But when still, it settled into a nearly solid mass. The finest of fine sand that had blown into this desert sink into which this well was dug. A new idea was needed to fix the sanding problem. Julian brought in Mr. Paul Hoke to work on the next plan for the well, to dig a shaft adjacent and tunnel into the side of the well, essentially to increase the volume of water exposed to the windmill pump rods and cylinder to diminish the agitation which was causing the sand to stir. About 10 feet from the windmill tower, they took turns digging a 4x4 square foot shaft by hand. By the end of the first day, they achieved a depth of 12 feet. It being too deep to throw the dirt out by hand, they then hitched up the horse and an ore bucket and continued the digging. They used 2x12 planks around the shaft opening to keep it from caving in. And somewhere around 55 feet or so, the cable broke and the bucket spun backwards through the pulley at a screeching speed. Luckily, Paul, being an experienced miner, always looking up, saw the falling bucket and stepped into the corner of the shaft. The next day, water began collecting in the bottom of the shaft. More lumber was needed to hold back the walls of that, and as they continued to dig at least another 20 feet, before starting laterally with the tunnel to the well under the windmill tower. They used a pump to keep the water level down during the tunneling. To shore this tunnel, they installed redwood timber frames notched in such a way as to fit them together with an inward slant to lock in place without nails. Julian's book, Raising the Dust, details it all, but ultimately they were able to chisel into the side of the actual well casing to supply more water to the windmill shaft. The last 2 days, they worked in water up to their armpits, wearing just underwear and shoes. The completed shaft and tunnel enabled the windmill to deliver its average flow without unduly agitating the quicksand. In 1917, water from the well was also used at a stamp mill to process ore from the Crystal mine located about a half a mile north. It is said that the well continued to produce into 1956, which was long past the 20 years that Swarty had hoped for. From there, folks could head southeast to Joshua Tree, 29 Palms area, or back towards the Retchie Well and the Pipes Canyon via Giant Rock. So back near Giant Rock, we will visit the Retchie Well site right in here, which is also located at the Integratron today in Landers. This is at Lynn Road and Belfield Boulevard. Charles Retchie was one of the first Teamsters to visit the Warren homestead in Morongo Valley, where he met and later married Frances Warren. In 1914, while returning home from deer hunting, he traveled along the flanks of Goat Mountain to avoid the wind. Somewhere along the route, he spotted a piece of float. He had it assayed, and lo and behold, it contained gold. He returned to Goat Mountain, traced the float up the mountain, and began to dig. Early on, he carried his ore to Surprise Springs to a mill for processing. As time went on, he realized he needed a closer water source and found it in Pipes Wash to the west of the mountain. He found water at 28 feet. He moved to the area next to the Integratron site, which he did sell to Mr. Van Tassel in 1950. He built a stone house, portions still existing, and an arastra to improve his mining operations. He worked the mine until 1932, with his total claim worth $6,000, but gold at only $20 an ounce. The mine ownership passed to 3 men known as the Swedes, and then on to others, but all claims are currently expired. There are other wells noted in the record at this site, one originally owned by Shea and another that was an open pit well. I couldn't find much information on these, but the records seem to indicate that the Integratron is still using the original Retchie well. This would be a photo from the Retchie homestead looking east to Goat Mountain and the Bullion Mountains in the far background. And as an aside, according to Morgan Retchie, grandson of Charles, The name Goat Mountain originated in the late 1800s when Angora goats were driven from Mexico to Canada, and apparently one got away. I never found any reference to this story, but Julian Gobar described the ill-fated attempt to raise Angora goats shipped into whitewater from Arizona and herded into the area. The herd grew to over 1,100, but the enterprise was a complete failure due to lack of food, predatory coyotes, and loco weed. Some ultimately escaped the herd and were encountered in the wild from time to time. Here's just some pictures of what the area might have looked like to the pioneers traveling across the landscape between Landers, Goat Mountain, and Pipes Canyon and the San Bernardino Mountains. The next stop on this journey is into the Pipes Canyon area. Here is our site. This is Highway 247 and Pipes Canyon Road right here. From early 1900 to 1957, ranchers grazed cattle here during the winter and used the Pipes Wash windmill to water the stock. Between 1910 and 1916, many 160-acre homesteads were filed. The Hurd, Pierce, Carricker, Sargent, McKinney, and Shea families were among the first to brave the challenge of staying 3 to 5 years and trying to raise a crop on desert farms as required by the homestead laws. Discouraged by lack of water, depredation of crops by animals, including cattle, and harsh living conditions, others who filed gave up and left the area. This was one of the few areas where folks could find water for drinking, bathing, and laundry until they could dig a well of their own. The Windmill was a well-known landmark where early travelers and pioneers got their water. The well was established there between 1913 and 1925. An adobe was built in 1935, but was not waterproofed, which may explain why there are no remnants. This site is recorded as a historical period archaeological site. Located on the old Sarah Shea homestead, a tract called the Windmill and Tank, and used by the Barker and Shea cattle ranchers. The cattle operation stopped due to complaints from surrounding homesteaders. In 1950s, there was a 10-foot diameter metal tank open at the top, sitting on a wood frame, and it was directly north of the windmill. Water would be pumped out of the well into the tank. The tank had an overflow pipe that emptied into a cement trough. In the early 50s, local kids would swim in the tank and dive off the windmill frame into it. In 1973, the windmill was still pumping water. A windmill in the desert is a beautiful thing. In the silence and oppressive heat at noon, or under the stars at night, the whir of the blades, even the squeak of the rod pumping, are like music. They sing of cool water, water to drink, water that flows, green trees growing. These trees grew up and around the tank stand. Birds nested there, and the children played in the water that trickled away, content in the land of shimmering heat. I share that quote of reflection from Sand in My Shoe by Ms. Helen Bagley. Traveling up Pipe Canyon is the next stop on our History of Water tour. And we'll move right over here to an area known as Pipes Convalescence Home. It is believed the Pipes area was first settled by the Mormons that pulled away from Brigham Young on their trip to the Promised Land. Here they supposedly worked and farmed for many years. Old-timers say in the early 1900s, water ran most of the year in Pipes Canyon, so this was probably one of the water sources. Water may also have come from a spring close by that is no longer present. In the early 1900s, the area was used by the cattle ranchers Barker and Shea and Talmadge Ranch. That would include the pioneer town, Rim Rock, Pipes Canyon, and Yucca Mesa areas. Near a cabin at the Pipes, they built a small reservoir fed by a ditch to water their cattle. About 1915, Walter and Emma Garris made application for their 160-acre homestead in the southwest quarter of Section 12 and was granted the patent in 1928. But by 1923, they were making a living growing alfalfa, tomatoes, and vegetables. And for some years, they raised as many as 500 turkeys a season. In 1924, Fred and Barbara Pierce moved to the area and built and operated a healthy and successful tuberculosis rest home on the homestead. The monthly fee in 1930 was $45. The home, built of cement pipes at Pipes Canyon, was a big project in the 20s. The building materials were hauled from Banning, but the 12.5-inch cement pipes were said to have been found abandoned in the area. It was in late 1935 that Walter Garris began building a rock dam. To be about 30 feet high, he wanted to create a 20-acre lake for fishing, boating, and swimming. They planned to stock it with bass and catfish, but it looks like they abandoned their project after reaching only 4 or 5 feet. And here is the dam reservoir rock wall right here. I know this picture is hard to see, but there sure is a lake and folks swimming. And this was said to be the lake that they created behind that dam. Here are the ruins of the main home that can be found today. Moving into the Yucca Valley area, we'll take a brief look at Warren's Well. Warren's Well is located along the runway of the Yucca Valley Airport at Highway 247. Cattleman Mark Chuck Warren came to San Bernardino around 1860 from his home state of Maine. He found work as a freighter and hauled goods from San Bernardino to Arizona and beyond. He leased government land and at 49 years old, dug the area's first well by hand to 160 feet with the help of his sons in 1881. It became known as Warren's Well. Over time, the Warren built a windmill to pump the water and established the first settlement in the area. The site was well known to those who watered their cattle and used the holding pens after bringing their stock from Big Bear in the winter. Warren's Well became a way station for travelers through the area and also a stage stop. Activity was abundant at the site, serving mail deliveries, social dances, barbecues, cattle branding, weekly laundry, and baby bathing. In 1909, the Talmadge brothers bought the well and used it for their headquarters during spring roundups. 1947 was the last cattle drive through Yucca Valley. The next watering hole on our venture would be in Joshua Tree at the Coyote Wells, not to be confused with Coyote Holes, which I never found much information about. The Coyote Wells well is located on Sunfair at Verbena, just off Highway 62, north of Highway 62. The actual Coyote Well was drilled about 1915, and in 1919, this 5-foot deep cement block water tank was constructed. It ran by windmill, but also by gas engine, about 70% of the time windmill and 30% engine. Water level at the time was about 170 feet. From 1915 to the early 1920s, this was the only known water supply in the Copper Mountain Basin. The water was considered good with elevated iron. From here, we're going to travel to the Mesquite Springs in 29 Palms. This spring is a shallow desert trough where water rises to the surface through the desert alluvium under a slight artesian head. Beginning around 5000 BC, various Indian tribes started visiting Mesquite Springs mainly during the winter months. In the late 1700s, the Spanish visit Mesquite Springs mainly to explore and mine for precious metals. In the 1880s, antelope, deer, grizzly bear, and mountain lions lived in the Mesquite Springs area. By 1900, cattlemen began using the springs to water their cattle in the winter. On October 3rd and 4th, 1909, Willie Boy visited the spring during his flight from the law. A man by the name of J.C. Christie claimed the springs to have such an abundance of water the year round that he was able to run a stamp mill about 1.5 miles away. Persons passing those springs would be astonished to see sand dunes 25 to 35 feet high, covering thousands of acres, but would be more surprised on going to the top of the dunes to find the tops of trees protruding from there. Mr. Christie says that within the dunes are buried large mesquite trees that have been covered by the sand and therefore preserved. It was noted that mesquite wood makes the finest wood for fuel. But a Mr. Wilson claims to have put a stick of dynamite into one of the dunes and blew out over 150 cords of wood. Visualize that as a pile 4 feet high and 1,200 feet long. In more modern times, around 1940, Mr. William B. Hatch Jr., a water sports enthusiast in his pre-desert days, organized a 29 Palms Land Yacht Club. Over 100 persons attended the first meeting on Mesquite Dry Lake, and many land yachters visited with their wheeled sailboats. Just to the south of Mesquite Springs lies the oasis of Mara. The oasis of Mara is also located along a fault trend. This photo here is from 1889. It was prior to that, in 1855, when Colonel Henry Washington had been surveying the San Bernardino baseline for the U.S. Geological Survey, when he realized that no previous written record had been made of the oasis that he had found. He made an entry in his log, June 29, 1855. From this corner in Indian Wigwam, near a spring of good water, supposed to be permanent and a small cluster of cabbage palmettos, he had just discovered the oasis. This area was originally inhabited by Kimahueve Indians and Serrano, using the oasis as a camp and source of water around 1870. It is a site along the Salt Song Trail, which extends over 1,000 miles across the southwest landscape, passing through deserts, canyons, and mountain ranges. The Salt Song Trail also travels through present and former villages of the Southern Paiute, Mojave, Kahia, and Kimahueve people, along with oases, springs, rivers, and tanihas, where water collected and they receive much needed refreshment in the arid desert. My final story is about how resources were developed after the cattle and mining days of the early 1900s in an area that came to be known as Surprise Valley. About mid-century, more and more folks relocated to the high desert. Small water companies were formed here and there as a result of individual community needs or developments. One of these small mutual water companies was formed in the Copper Mountain Mesa area north of Joshua Tree. So we have Winters Road and Border. Here's Coyote Pass, I believe that is, and Highway 62 down here. The Surprise Valley Water Association seems to be the last of its kind in our area, a dream realized by Lavina and Edwin Littlefield, one of dozens of families that had relocated to the Copper Mountain Mesa area in the late 1960s. Getting water meant a trip 10 to 12 miles to Joshua Tree or Landers to fill bottles, jugs, milk cans, or whatever. Joined by Ruth and Bob Stadler, they collected the names of serious parties and presented them to the existing Joshua Tree Water Company just down the road. They were ignored. So they continued their quest, finally establishing the Surprise Valley Water Association and sold shares using a model they learned from the Hacienda Water Company already established in Morongo Valley. An early contact had been James Krieger, counsel for the Mojave Water Agency. His recommendations were not well taken. They chose to stick with a Mr. Leslie Hosegood, engineer for the Hacienda Water Company, as well as the Desert View County Water District in Flamingo Heights. At the time, Southern California Edison Company had a service whereby they would send Mr. Jerry Smith to douse for water in the area and advise folks where to put their wells. Jerry located the water, which is on BLM land that was ultimately purchased under the Small Tracts Act. In September 1969, the well drilling started. The well was drilled to 600 feet and produced 216 gallons a minute. The water tested good except for high fluoride, so a large reservoir was dug. And the well was pumped for 62 days in an attempt to pump it out. That is, the fluoride. It was unsuccessful. However, this aquifer has experienced zero drawdown since the well was constructed. Basically, the test demonstrates the vast quantity of water stored in the aquifer below. The ultimate goal for the community was to develop a pressurized water supply system that would go to various drop stations in the area. That plan never panned out, so the juggers and the tankers traveled to the well site and got in line. The association is now dissolved, and the well is maintained by just 2 of the remaining members. A side note on Jerry Smith. In 1971, D. Davis wrote in the Yucca Valley News that Jerry had been known as, quote, the king of the bent twig sleuths, unquote. For 22 years, he had located over 9,000 wells and not a one of them dry. The strange technique called radiesthesia, Greek meaning sensitive to radiations, dates back as far as 1200 BC. In Tales from Pinyon Ridge, Miss Jean Burns talks of her personal experience with witching. At times, I would try so hard to hold a wand upright with my elbows tightly pressed at my sides that the outside edges of my 4th finger would be skinned. The wand moved, and when it was ready to move, beyond any effort I could make to hold it still, quite soon I found that I could no longer wear a wristwatch or a fob watch or carry any kind of watch. Nothing kept time for me anymore. A watch stopped when it had been fully wound or ran several hours slow or fast in the course of a day. No amount of checking or repair made any difference. So in conclusion, I've spent many years of my career, 35 years of my career, on a drilling rig platform. And I can certainly say that there is a big difference between getting water then and getting water now. To round out the presentation, I do have a host of references that I have used, and I'd like to thank the Old Schoolhouse Museum and the Desert Institute for inviting me to speak tonight. And at this point, I'd be happy to answer any questions if I can. So I do see a couple questions here. Are you familiar with the 29 Palms 2014 groundwater report and how it addresses the septic system return flows to our aquifers? I am not familiar with that study, and so I can't speak to that. Second question is the Mesquite Springs on base, and I believe it is on base or very close to the base boundary. Are there any other questions? Gabicia, are you there? I see another question here. Where is that pipe building? I do believe it's called Pipes Canyon, maybe because of the pipeline they built in there, but that is near the corner of Pioneer Town Road and Pipes Canyon Road, off a road called Bullwhip. And I have not located the stirrup tank. I don't know if there's still water at Ames Well. The word there is that it was working until 1956. It could have just collapsed by that time, but it's out on the Marine Basin, so I'm not sure. And I'm just sort of scrolling through to see if there's any other questions.
Okay, I think I'm back.
There you are. Earth cake.
Sorry about that. I think you've gone through most of the questions that I had on my list. So that is really good. Let me see if there's anything else. Did you get to see the latest questions about what do you feel about sustainability of water resources in the 29 Palms area?
I'm going to go with no comment on that one tonight. And it was a lot of fun going out to these sites. Most of these sites you can get to today, which I think gives it a nice historic perspective.
That's really cool. Thanks for sharing that. How fun was it locating all these historic sites?
Well, as Kevin knows, it's been 3 years in the making. So it's been a lot of fun. Rock Corral is still flowing. I was there a few weeks ago. It's low, but it's still flowing. I'm looking for some other questions on the chat part.
I saw one at the beginning that asked, is there still water at Ames Well?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think I answered that one. I think it said the research showed that it ran and it produced till 1956. And then
wow. Okay.
I don't know of any natural hot springs in the area. There's a question here by J.C. Lee Ray. I did, there is so much information on the Oasis and the Native American presence there. It just would have buried me. So I would refer you to the 29 Palms Historical Society on that. They have a lot there and in their archives. And they have a wonderful library too of old books. And then you said the presentation will be available. I see some people asking.
Yeah, I want to let everyone know that as soon as we finish the live stream, you will be able to watch the presentation. And also on Saturday, it will be posted on the Desert Institute's YouTube channel. Are there any other questions coming in?
And thank you everyone for your patience with the platform.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry that for some reason it has done this to me and one another time when I couldn't unmute myself, but then I have to come in as an external guest and do the little workaround. But thank you everyone for your patience. I agree, Kitty, it will be great to have a caravan trip to all these places. Maybe that's a great Desert Institute field class idea. So we'll keep note of that because I think that will be really great. Thank you so much, Marina, for a fabulous presentation. I think we all learned a lot, and I think water is such an important topic when we're talking about the desert. So Thank you for giving us all those insights. Is there anything else that you would like to add before we wrap up?
No, just that, of course, my talk was about modern man, and of course not about the Native Americans that have been in the area for a long, long time. And so I don't want to show any disrespect for them.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for acknowledging that. And without much else tonight, I just want to thank you, everyone who joined us. We really appreciate your support. I'm going to post some ways that you can continue to support the Desert Institute and the 29 Palms Historical Society. Also links to other places where you can see some of our live events. And also remember that you're going to receive a link to the recording of this event in your email. So stay tuned. Thank you so much. And we'll see you again in a month. Thank you, Marina.
Thank you, Alicia. Good night,
Bye-bye.
everyone.